Something that's been hotly debated over the years is the topic of platform longevity. Does it matter? What are the benefits? Who does it benefit? And is it something that you should even factor into the buying decision? And well, the list just goes on. Now, the first really good example we have of a well-supported platform was AMD's previous generation AM4. And look, AMD did attempt to screw it all up, but in the end, the community didn't let them. And I think many agree that it's now going down as one of the absolute best PC platforms in history. But even with a clear example like AM4 to point to, there are still those that argue platform longevity doesn't matter, which is a pretty interesting stance to take in my opinion, given what we have seen from AM4. And I can understand someone claiming that it didn't benefit them directly because maybe they bought in at a time when it wasn't of real advantage, or they're just happy to buy a new motherboard with every CPU upgrade because they can, or whatever other reason they come up with. But to claim that it doesn't matter, period, I think is a bit of a wild take. At least that's how I've seen it over the years. Having the option to upgrade your CPU without having to throw away your motherboard just seems like something that everyone should be in favor of, and I fail to see the drawbacks of such an option. That being the case, as we move forward, AMD's AM5 platform continues to age, but we should see at least one more CPU generation, possibly two if the rumors are to be believed. And then we have Intel's next generation Nova Lake CPUs, which should arrive later this year on the new LGA 1954 socket. And that means Intel's current platform, which uses the LGA 1851 socket, will only see the release of the Core Ultra 2 series, along with a refresh, which I'd personally categorize as disastrous when it comes to support. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Gigabyte and their Aorus Radeon RX 9070 XT Elite, one of the most feature-packed 9070 XTs on the market, and arguably the best looking, thanks to the RGB halo design, a triple ring lighting effect that provides unique visuals. But the Aorus Elite isn't just a flashy looking graphics card, it packs a massive vapor chamber cooler that allows it to sustain the highest core clocks of any 9070 XT that we've tested, and we've tested pretty much all of them. This resulted in some of the best out-of-the-box performance, and combine that with the strong feature set, which includes dual BIOS support, massive aluminium backplate with pass-through area, dual HDMI outputs, ARGB lighting, a GPU support that includes a wide range of adjustment, and you have a real winner. Which is why we recommend checking out Gigabyte's Aorus Radeon RX 9070 XT Elite via the link in the video description. So then, with Nova Lake expected later this year, and then we'll get Zen 6 possibly shortly after that, though not clear at this point, but it's likely Zen 6 will follow Nova Lake. All of this got me thinking, just how much weight will a feature like platform support have on those product releases? So, in an effort to try and address this once and for all, get to the bottom of it, I know a foolish endeavor, but I did spend a few weeks revisiting older hardware to see where things, or really just see how things have played out to this point in time. Of course, we haven't looked at all of the possible combinations and CPUs and stuff because that would be pretty impossible to cover in one video, but we've looked at most of the flagship CPUs, at least flagship CPUs for gaming from each company, and with AM4, it all started back in March of 2017. The first wave of Ryzen 1000 series processors based on the original Zen architecture included the Ryzen 7 1700, the 1700X, and the 1800X, all of which were 8-core 16-thread CPUs priced between $330 and $500 US. Now, given all models were unlocked, they were essentially the same thing. So that being the case, the most affordable model, the Ryzen 7 1700, got the most attention from consumers. If we look back at my initial Ryzen review, I concluded by stating that when it comes to productivity and content creation, the new Ryzen CPUs are very impressive. The gaming results, on the other hand, they weren't as strong as we'd hoped for, though they were competitive enough. And while I noted there was real potential with the Zen architecture, for the best gaming experience possible, you really did need an Intel CPU, namely the Core i7 7700K. Looking back at the 16-game benchmark I made 9 years ago now, we see that on average at 1080p, the 7700K was 21% faster than the 1800X, and back then games were very lightly threaded and often only used 1 to 2 cores. So an 8-core CPU like the 1800X had no real advantage when it came to gaming. Today, the 1800X finds itself much better utilized by modern games, but even so, across 14 titles, we still found that the Core i7 7700K was an average 13% faster when using the medium quality settings at 1080p. So the margin has certainly come down now that the 1800X and its 8 cores are better utilized. But the point is, if you wanted the best gaming performance back in 2017, you did need to buy an Intel CPU. In fact, AMD wasn't even able to match the 7700K's gaming performance until the following year with Zen Plus. The 2700X was similar to the 7700K, at least in the more CPU demanding games, and if we test both of them today, which does result in the use of much more demanding games, we find that they are very much neck and neck. So despite being a lowly quad-core, it seems as though the 7700K has aged surprisingly well, and that would be thanks to its hyper-threading support, which provides it with 8 threads. Now, by the time the 2700X did arrive, Intel had already tacked on 2 additional cores to the 7700K by creating the 8700K, which sadly did require a new motherboard in order to use, so you couldn't simply upgrade from a 7th gen Core Series processor to an 8th gen model. So then, if we take a look at the early 2017 flagship products, we had the 1800X for $500 US, though technically the 1700 was pretty similar, just 5% slower on average, and it was much cheaper, and given that it's an unlocked part, it could be overclocked to match the 1800X with ease. So that was really the part people bought, but the 1800X was technically the flagship. And then from Intel, we had the 7700K for around $360 US, so about $30 more than the 1700, though just months after release, that part could be found for as low as $300 US, as AMD was quite aggressive on pricing. They did need Ryzen to succeed. So at the time, I strongly advised viewers ignore the 1800X and instead buy the discounted 1700, and of course, many of you did exactly that. So if you ended up buying a Ryzen 7 1700 rather than Intel's slightly more expensive and faster Core i7 7700K, and you did so fully knowing that the Intel CPU was superior for gaming, would AMD's platform longevity play to your advantage? Well, based on our updated data, the Core i7 7700K is still 12% faster than the 1800X, making it 18% faster than the 1700, so very similar to what we actually saw 9 years ago now. To upgrade the 7700K, you would need a new motherboard, but let's say you kept this purchase for 4 to 5 years, which seems reasonable and about how long most of you tell us you keep your CPU for before upgrading. Of course, some of you, though, upgrade much sooner than that, while others much later. But based on polling data, the typical time frame appears to be about 4 to 5 years. And that would bring us to 2021 to 2022. And at that point, you can buy the impressive Core i9 12900K, and you could get away with keeping your DDR4 memory with that processor, but let's be real here, most 12900K shoppers weren't going to run that thing with what's likely 16 gigabytes of DDR4 memory. I'm sure some people did, but a lot of you probably bought a new memory kit as well, either a greater capacity kit in the DDR4 flavor, or you went with greater capacity and greater performance with DDR5. So based on our freshly updated Core i9 12900K data using premium DDR5 7200 memory, the 12900K averaged 179 FPS using the medium quality settings, and that's an impressive 88% increase over the 7700K. So I'd say that kind of performance uplift is worthy of an upgrade. But on the other hand, the Ryzen 7 1700 owner has had many good options over the years. For example, a cheap Zen 2 upgrade would have boosted performance by almost 40%, and that makes it a good bit faster than the 7700K. There's also Zen 3 options, the 5800X for example, that's 70% faster than the 7700K and just 20% slower than the 12900K, and it also uses DDR4 memory, whereas the 12900K data that we're looking at here does use premium DDR5 7200 memory. And of course, that's not the end of the road for an AM4 user. 4 months after the release of the 12900K, AMD released the 5800X 3D, which according to our latest data is currently 5% faster than the 12900K. And again, the 5800X 3D, being an AM4 processor, is using DDR4 3600 memory, while we tested the 12900K with DDR5 7200 memory. So to recap, the initial build cost in early 2017 is very similar between the Core i7 7700K and Ryzen 7 1700, but for gaming, the 7700K was considerably faster. But of course, the 1700 is still very usable, even to this day, and it did age reasonably well as games have become increasingly CPU demanding. There were multiple ideal upgrade points between 2017 and 2022. Again, parts like the 3700X dropped as low as $260 US in July of 2020, so that would have been a really cheap upgrade. So given that the AMD or Intel path required you to spend a very similar amount of money initially, in order for the Ryzen owner to match the gaming performance of the 7700K, they would have needed to buy at least a 2700X or really anything after that. The 2700X did drop to $200 US in 2019, but waiting 2 years and spending $200 more just to match the 7700K's gaming performance, that obviously doesn't make sense. Therefore, if you did manage to hold out until early 2022, when the 5800X 3D arrived, you'd be looking at a $450 US upgrade bill. Now, the 7700K owner, on the other hand, they would need to spend at least $610 US on the 12900K if they wanted to get as close as they could to 5800X 3D-like performance. And then they'd have to spend $220 on a DDR4-enabled Z690 motherboard if they wanted to keep their original memory, or closer to $300 US for a DDR5 motherboard. And back then, DDR5 pricing was very cooked, much like it is today, but let's just pretend that memory was reasonable back when these CPUs were released. Let's say $120 US for a 32GB kit. This would have made the Intel platform upgrade around $1,000 US, or just over $800 US if you want to keep your existing DDR4 memory. But opting for DDR4 would see the 1200K perform a bit slower than what we're showing here. So if we're to assume you wanted to go with DDR5 performance to fully unlock the 1200K, you'd be looking at a $1,000 US upgrade bill or thereabouts, versus about $450 US on the AMD side if you were to go with the 5800X 3D. But now the tables have turned and it's AMD who would be offering the superior gaming performance. Of course, it's not quite as simple as that, and as I said, there's so many options to cover here that it'd be very difficult. The Intel upgrade, you could go for a 12700K, for example. That was an option, quite a bit cheaper, around $430 US, but of course you would still need a new motherboard and probably memory. But this was the better value choice because it was only slightly slower than the 1200K. The upgrade proposition, though, only gets worse for Intel as you scale down the product stack. The 12600K, for example, that was certainly a strong performer, and it was released at just $310 US, which was a really good deal, and our review said so. But again, once you throw in $200 plus for a motherboard and then probably new memory, the value aspect of it starts to get a little bit ugly, and at that point the AM4 owners would point to the cheaper and much easier to slot in 5700X, which really isn't a great deal slower. Now, the crazy thing about the AM4 platform, or maybe the crazy thing about Intel's competing platforms, is that it took Intel 4 separate sockets to match its performance. As in, from Zen to Zen 3 with 3D V-Cache, Intel released 4 completely incompatible platform sockets, starting with LJ1151 in early 2017, only to be replaced with LJ1151-2 in late 2017, the same year, which was in no way compatible. Not forwards, not backwards. It was the exact same socket with zero compatibility. The LJ1151 version 2-2, whatever you want to call it, that socket, it also supported 9th gen series processors, adding 2 more cores at the top end before being dumped once again for LJ1200, which supported the 10th gen series along with the abomination that was Intel's 11th gen series, which pretty much managed to go backwards in more ways than one. So not sure you can count that as a new or a second CPU architecture on the same socket if it managed to go backwards. And then that socket ended up getting dumped for LGA 1700, which supported the 12th gen series along with the 13th gen, which was then, I guess, refreshed to a sort of fake next generation, which just was the 14th gen chip. So that was just sort of 13th generation again for the most part. And while all of that socket hopping was going on over at Intel, AMD just kept churning out AM4 processors before finally arriving at the 5800X 3D, after which point they pretty much just bin processors for new models, ignoring the APUs, of course. So in my opinion, the amount of platform flexibility that platform longevity or sticking with the same socket and maintaining compatibility, the flexibility that affords customers is staggering. Now, Intel did eventually beat AM4 on the LJ1700 socket, and based on our most up-to-date data, the 13900K is on average 13% faster than the 5800X 3D, while the refreshed 14900K is 14% faster. Of course, as I've alluded to already, evaluating the full value of the AM4 platform is extremely difficult, as pricing did vary in some regions, and with so many possible upgrade options on one socket, it really is virtually impossible to evaluate all of them, especially given the pricing for certain models. It varied wildly. There was insane sales in certain regions. Other regions didn't get those sales, or they got them on a different part. So yeah, there was deals all over the place really with AM4. And this was true even of the mighty 5800X 3D, which hit an all-time low price of just $330 US in late 2022, incredibly the same year of its release. Meanwhile, the 5800X, that was down around $250 US, and the 5600X at just $160 US. So there were loads of very affordable in-slot upgrades for AM4 owners, and this was true for almost the entirety of the platform's life. Now, if we look at the gaming performance offered by the flagships over the years, ignoring AMD's 12 and 16 core models, as they weren't really gaming CPUs, and for much of AM4's life, they were generally a bit worse for gaming than the single CCD models. But if we look at that performance, we see that across the flagships, Intel really was king for much of that period. As we've already seen, the 7700K was clearly superior to any of the Ryzen 7 models of that period, including the 1800X. The 8700K just furthered the gap, and it would take AMD 2 more generations to roughly match it with the 3800X. But by the time that happened, the 9900K was already out on shelves and was faster again. Then in 2020, we got the 10900K and 5800X. Performance was similar, but Intel generally still had an edge for gaming. It really wasn't until 2022 that AMD came out on top, though later in the year we did get the 13th gen Raptor Lake parts from Intel, which were faster again, but they were more competing with AM5 by that point. My point is though, for the majority of AM4's life, Intel was the king of gaming. They offered the highest performing models, and this was made very clear in countless of our top 5 best CPU videos that pointed to parts like the 7700K, the 8700K, the 9900K as the best no-compromise gaming CPUs. And yet, despite all of that, by the time Zen 2 arrived, it was clear Intel was in a spot of bother. And while some were in denial about that, the writing was very clearly on the wall. Intel's retail sales were taking a hit as AMD started moving more Ryzen inventory than really anyone expected. And then by the time Zen 3 arrived, the battle seemed almost over. And then by the time we got our first X3D part, it pretty much was. So the real question is, how was AMD able to so quickly and effectively dismantle the behemoth that was Intel? Because they didn't do it with outright performance, at least not initially. So it certainly wasn't chart-topping performance that got the ball rolling. I personally attribute the success of Ryzen to a few things that, when combined, made buying into the platform irresistible for most customers. First and foremost, there's the value. Value for money, Ryzen was unbeatable. You got near enough for most gamers to Intel performance, coupled with excellent productivity, that generally exceeded what Intel had to offer even from their uber-expensive HEDT CPUs, as well as modern features, all at a bargain basement price. Then adding to the value was of course platform longevity, something I viewed as a key feature. AMD was also very aggressive with sales, with regular discounts, while Intel pricing remained pretty consistent through much of AM4's existence, especially earlier on. As I was making this video, I decided to run a poll, though sadly on YouTube we are very limited in the number of options we can provide in our polls, which seems a bit silly. Anyway, with the limited options we had available, the feedback was clear. You guys bought Ryzen over anything Intel had to offer at the time because you saw greater value in the AMD options, which, makes sense. And it proves the masses clearly prioritize value over outright performance. Now, future platform support was an individual option here, but really it does pretty clearly tie into value for money. So platform support alone won't sell anyone on a purchase. You have to also offer compelling products for that platform, which again makes complete sense. Now, all of that said, I really do think that if AMD had executed the same TikTok type strategy that Intel were implementing at the time, which meant we would see just one major CPU architecture per socket, I think if that was the case, Zen, Zen Plus, Zen 2, and Zen 3 wouldn't have enjoyed anywhere near the same level of success. And I'm extremely confident about that. That being the case, moving forward, what does all of this mean for Intel and to a lesser degree AMD? For Intel's upcoming Nova Lake-based CPUs, it means they're going to need to offer more value than AMD. They're going to need to give customers a really good reason to invest in LGA 1954. Not only does performance need to be highly competitive, but so too does the pricing. And on top of all of that, they really have to, without question in my opinion, promise multiple new CPU architectures on the same socket. I feel at this point, Intel simply cannot succeed without doing that. They really cannot run 4 sockets to AMD's 1 again. History can't repeat itself there, and they are already a socket down with LGA 1851. As I said, an absolute disaster of a platform in terms of support, and I think it's fair to say a bit of a disaster in general. The retail sales data very much supports that opinion, and I'm not terribly confident that the Arrow Lake refresh is going to help all that much. Unfortunately, there have been few highlights for Intel over the past decade, and although parts like the 10th gen Comet Lake processors, they were really decent, they were unfortunately followed up by the disastrous 11th gen that kind of tainted that socket. It wasn't exactly a viable upgrade for anyone who purchased a 10th gen CPU, so again, resulted in a bit of a dead platform for those that bought into it, because we moved from that to the 12th gen socket, which was again really good. I loved the 12th gen processors. They all received a highly positive review from me. But then when we got to 13th gen, things started to get a bit dicey. Power consumption started to get out of control. And yeah, we obviously know how that platform played out with stuff like degradation issues and stuff of Core i7 and Core i9 13th and 14th gen processors. Wasn't really a good way to wrap up that platform. So I think it's fair to say it's been a rocky few years for Intel, to say the least. AMD, on the other hand, appears to be powering along as strong as ever, though they would want to be careful. Zen 6 does need to be something special in order for AM5 to have any chance of repeating the success of AM4, and ideally Zen 7 following up on the same socket that would cement its success. So in conclusion, I think looking back at how these processors perform in today's games, it's clear that achieving a 124% performance increase on a single platform when going from the 1800X to the 5800X 3D is incredible and something we should all want to see more of. Meanwhile, the biggest uplift we've managed to see while remaining on the same socket from Intel over the past 10 years is 15%. And that was seen when going from the 12900K to the 14900K, which is pretty difficult to view as a technological advancement, given that power draw in the stock configuration, mind you, increased by almost 50%. And that's a 50% power increase for a 15% FPS boost when CPU limited. So we are talking about power draw in games and not just when blasting all the cores to 100% usage. And the 5800X 3D wasn't just 124% faster on average when compared to the 1800X for gaming, it also consumes a little less power for good measure. So comparing what AMD's managed to achieve with AM4 to what Intel's done over the exact same period of time with 4 different sockets, it doesn't really seem like a comparison. And I guess that's why Amazon's best CPU seller list has looked the way it has for the better part of 5 years now. As I've alluded to multiple times now, there are obviously many more comparisons that could be made here. There's so many different CPUs from AMD and Intel, so you can point to different matchups as making sense or not making sense, as, you know, platform longevity makes sense here, it doesn't here. I get all of that, but I feel that we've in no way misrepresented the history of all of this with the examples that we provided, because if we were to scale down to more mid-range CPUs, the importance on platform longevity actually increases as the CPUs approach pricing parity with the motherboards, and then your entry-level options actually dip below. So the further you go down sort of the CPU food chain, I think the more important features like platform longevity become. And while I really do feel that a feature like platform longevity is more important for lower-end shoppers, It appears to have this unintended effect where it seems to boost consumer confidence, encouraging consumers to invest more in the platform as they know it's going to last them much better into the future with almost guaranteed great CPU upgrade options. At least I think that's what people are thinking with AM5 based on what we've seen with AM4. Now, AM5 certainly hasn't panned out that way yet, but we'll have to see what Zen 6 offers potentially later this year or early next year. But the reason I think all of this is because I don't really know how else to explain parts like the 7800X3D and the 9800X3D, which are expensive CPUs. Don't know how to explain them dominating CPU sales charts. Historically, this has been your Core i3s, your Core i5s, and Ryzen 5s, but today the masses seem more interested in buying parts like the 9800X3D. And this has been the case ever since the release of the 7800X3D 3 years ago now. And look, I'm sure there's going to be some people that go, oh, that's because reviewers are so misleading with their low resolution benchmarks, make these X3D CPUs look super duper fast. But this is the same testing methodology that's been used. I've been doing this job for 25 years, somewhere around that time frame now, and we have tested CPUs using that same method that entire period of time, and it didn't result in high-end CPUs being sold in droves like what we're seeing today. So there's something else that's driving up the demand for these high-end X3D CPUs. It's not just chart-topping performance, because Intel used to blow AMD out of the water, and they didn't sell, those CPUs like we're seeing from AMD today. So it's unusual. Wrapping all of this up, I will just say, if someone's going to have a hot take from this video, I will just say at the end that our very basic stance on all of this is actually very simple. If there is no clear technical reason for a socket change, aka breaking platform compatibility, then don't do it. Maintain compatibility until a point in time where it legitimately doesn't make sense from a technical standpoint. So that's pretty much where we are on this platform longevity thing. We think it should be offered if it can be, and if it can't be, so be it. But, seeing stuff like we saw with Intel 7th gen to the 8th gen, where they actually had the exact same socket and there was no change at all, and people actually hacked BIOSes to show that the compatibility could be maintained. They just did it because they didn't want to. They want you guys to buy motherboards because they make money off chipsets and whatnot, and it helps with their partners and that. So they want to extract more money from you every upgrade, and I think they should only get more money from you if there is a legitimate reason to earn that money. Anyway, that's my opinion. Of course, I would love to hear what you guys think about this. So if you've made it this far in the video, first of all, thank you. Great job. And do drop your thoughts below, because I will be sure to read all of them. I really enjoy hearing what you guys think, and it helps me think about this content and the importance we should place on features like this moving forward. But anyway, I've probably said enough about platform longevity in this video, so I am going to wrap it up there. If you love what we do here at Unboxed and you want to support us a bit more, we do have the join button or Patreon. You can sign up to either one of those things and hear me talk about platform longevity all day in Discord. So that's... Actually, no, I don't do that. Sign up. You're not going to be abused that way, I promise. Tim will talk about monitor names or something, I don't know. There's also, if you do that, you will get access to behind-the-scenes content, Q&A stuff, and a monthly live stream, which we do for members only. So that's a pretty cool place to hang out, ask us questions directly, and we'll answer them live for you. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.